and welcome to Theology with Coffee. We are your hosts. My name is Kelson Wolverton.
I am Taylor Wood, and this is Casual Conversations about Deep Biblical Truth. We are continuing today with our series on the book of Revelation, working through chapter by chapter, verse by verse through the book of Revelation. And today we are doing the seventh seal in Revelation 8, and probably more. We're just going to see how far we get into that.
You never know with us. Amen.
Okay, so before we jump into Revelation 8, then let's just quickly bring people up to speed with where we've been in the book of Revelation.
Right.
So our author and date and situation, very quickly, what are we looking at there?
Yeah, we're saying that the author is the disciple John, and he is been exiled on the island of Patmos, and he has this vision to be able to see what is going on, and so much so to write this down. And this is supposed to be right after just this time of persecution, of rise of just even not only Christianity, but then also of just people trying to mock, to manipulate, to do whatever to stop Christianity. And this book is written in order to give you hope and encouragement, not only through persecution, but through any hard season. That no matter what happens, ultimately Jesus wins. And ultimately, as our wonderful speaker said this past Sunday, you ultimately win because you accepted Jesus. And so this is supposed to give hope and encouragement, not only to its audience, but also to us today.
Yeah. So the book of Revelation opens with these 7 letters to 7 churches, letters that deal with real churches that are historical and dealing with historical circumstances at that time.
Yeah.
The main body of the book, and what most people think of with the book of Revelation, starts in chapter 4 and 5, which is this great heavenly throne room scene. A throne room scene that, even though it seems to kick off the period of judgment, there's a lot of indications with that scene that it has an already but not yet aspect to it.
Yeah.
It deals with the finished work of Jesus Christ on the cross, but it also deals with his ultimate inauguration as king over the universe. Which is a future event. And so that chapter in and of itself sort of defies any sort of linear sequencing and how exactly it's going to play out. After this, the rest of the book is made up of a series of 7 visions, and that's where we're at now. We're kind of dealing with these 7 different visions. The first of these 7 visions is 7 seals. Today, we're going to get to the 7th seal. When the 7th seal is opened, we are going to get a series of 7 trumpets. And we're going to be getting into those trumpets. We don't know how many we'll get to today, but we'll be dealing with those 7 trumpets. And as I keep repeating the words 7 and 7 and 7, no, do not adjust your sets. I'm not making a mistake. We have 7 visions, 7 seals, 7 trumpets. You're noticing this repetition of these numbers.
You had 7 churches in the beginning.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Kelson, real briefly, because we're going to get into this again, you can't deal with Revelation without doing this. Talk about the significance of numerology in the Bible, the way that these numbers are being used, and specifically about how their primary purpose is not a literal recitation of numerical values, but they are pointing towards something symbolic, something deeper, something spiritual.
Yeah, so ultimately you're going to, not just in Revelation that we see this pattern of 7 or other numbers like 3, 6, 8, 40, you know what I mean? 1/3 is one, but we're eventually going to come up. But these numbers all throughout Scripture point to something that's even further. So 7 actually means perfection and completion. Well, what are other numbers that we see of 7? Well, 7 days of creation. We see that, 7 days from Palm Sunday to when Jesus rose from the dead, a resurrection. That all took place within 7 days. 7 days of walking around Jericho. This number of 7 continues to happen over and over and over again. 40, 40 days and 40 nights of the flood that came, 40 nights, 40 years of the people in Israel walking in the wilderness from 40 nights and days of Jesus not having any bread, any water, fasting in the wilderness by himself before Satan comes into play. So all these numbers point to something even more. And then, like I said, it's not like it's just random here and that we see in Revelation. You see it all from Genesis all the way to the very end of the Bible. And so knowing those numbers, and I've made a video about it before. I think we also, like in the beginning of Revelation on YouTube, I think I had like a little sheet that showed all the numbers that are really important. So please feel free to go back, do that, write it in your Bible, whatever, because I think those things are really important and just give a deeper biblical foundation when you're reading through stories of those specific numbers.
Yeah. And speaking of numbers, and specifically the number 40, we did an episode on the eclipse about a month and a half ago. And I do want to report that we are now over 40 days since that eclipse. The 40 days being what many people said, it was a 40-day window of the sign of Jonah that this eclipse was bringing on, and after 40 days there would be judgment. It hasn't happened, and as with many of these doomsday predictions, many of these alarmist biblical prophecy interpretations, people who express these views and Christians that share these views often end up looking very foolish because this is not the way that God operates. And so just another warning to be careful with sort of these interpretations, in particular the attempt to take modern astronomical signs like eclipses or certain constellations and read back into them some sort of prophetic significance. That's actually going to come into play depending on how far we get today. That's going to come into play with some of the stuff we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
So now with the seals, because we are now going to be wrapping up our 7 seals, which is the first of our 7 visions. You can get really tongue-tied when you keep going through all these 7s. Remember back to the throne room scene of chapter 4 and 5. Chapter 4 and 5 of the book of Revelation are very important. They set up all of these different visions. Chapter 4 and 5, we have this throne room scene. We have the presentation of a scroll which Kelsey and I interpreted for you as really the culmination of God's plan for this world in its current age or its current timeline. The scroll is the God's plan to not only judge wickedness, but also to save his people, bringing human history as we understand it to an end. The drama of the courtroom scene is that there is no angel, no human, nobody in heaven who is found who can open the scroll, thus bringing human history and God's judgment to a close, until the Lion of Judah and the slain lamb is presented as the one who will be king, and he will open the scroll. The scroll is sealed with 7 seals. We told you about the scroll cannot be opened until those 7 seals are taken off. These are 7 seals that go across the front of this scroll. The 6 seals are open. The first 6 seals are opened in chapter 6. After chapter 6, we get a break, a pause in the action in chapter 7, where we get the sealing, different type of sealing of the 144,000. And we also have the great multitude before the throne of God. And now we are back to the 7th seal. And so keep in mind kind of the narrative that we're following. The slain Lamb of God, who is the sacrifice that brings people into relationship with God through faith. He is about to open up the 7th seal, which is going to bring about the final judgment, bring about God's consummation of all of human history, and bring forth the new kingdom, the new heaven, the new earth, the new Eden, in which God will dwell with his people, and no more will there be any sin, rebellion, sadness, alienation, enmity, brokenness, all those things that define our current world system. So that's where we're at as we move forward in the narrative of the book of Revelation. Anything else you want to add? In that case, I say it's time we jump in. And Kelson, I'll leave it up to you. If you want to read all of 8, if you want to break it up into little chunks, I'll just kind of leave that up to you. And then we can kind of discuss what parts you find significant here.
I think I'm just going to read all of chapter 8, and then we're just going to break it up after that. So kind of keep it flow. So here we go, chapter 8. When the Lamb opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour. And then I saw the 7 angels who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. And another angel came and stood at the altar with a golden censer, and he was giving much incense to offer with the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar before the throne. And the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose from God from the hand of the angel. And then the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and threw it on the earth. And there was peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and an earthquake. Now the 7 angels who had the 7 trumpets prepared to blow them. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up. The second angel blew his trumpet, and something like a great mountain, burning with fire, was thrown into the sea, and a third of the sea became blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The angel blew his trumpet, and a great star fell from heaven, blazing like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of the water. And the name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many people died from the water, because it had been made bitter. And the fourth angel blew his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of their light might be darkened, and a third of the day might be kept from shining, and likewise a third of the night. And then I looked, and I heard an angel with a loud voice as it flew directly overhead. Woe, woe, woe to those who dwell on the earth, and at the blast of the other trumpets that the 3 angels are about to blow. And that is Revelation chapter 8.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, where do you want to start?
Yeah, so we see right here that the 7th seal is open. And when the Lamb opens up the 7th seal, you know what I mean? There's not, I think this is where it gets really interesting because, every seal there's been like something else happening and something this. But in the 7th seal, there's silence in heaven for about a half an hour. Mm-hmm. And you're thinking to yourself, well, you know what I mean? This is kind of unique, because at this point, there's always been something, catastrophe, you know what I mean? Some type of it. Instead, it is silence.
Yeah. It's another reminder, the book of Revelation is a very auditory book. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is John, as he's writing this vision, we often think of the spectacular visuals of the book, but there's also a lot of auditory imagery that is in the book. And I've said it before, Revelation is the most musical book of the Bible beside maybe Psalms, mm-hmm. right? Or Lamentations, which are all songs. Revelation is a very musical book. Here again, we're getting this very powerful auditory imagery, this time in contrast to some of the things we've gotten before. Mm-hmm. Whereas before, we've gotten this outburst of hymns and songs. Here we're getting this silence. I think here of a really good movie soundtrack, where sometimes you'll have these movie soundtracks when the action is going, it's hitting you with all this great music and it's getting you pumped up. But in moments of incredible tensity, good movie composers will often pull the music back.
Right.
And some of the most impactful moments in a movie soundtrack can actually be silence. Long stretches of silence where that tension builds and grows. And that's what we're getting here. We're getting a building of tension that's about to be poured out as we now get to this next section with the trumpets.
Yeah, and what do you think probably, there's been debaters and stuff about like this silence, right? Like why there is, and what do we think of John and the living creatures and the elders during this moment of silence? Like what do you think is probably going on in their brains and what's happening here?
Well, I think the theological significance of the silence, and in particular, I think it's interesting this half an hour of silence. There's a particular time period assigned to this silence. One of the things to remember is that not only in ancient Israel were there songs that were sung in worship, but there were times of silence that were a part of worship as well.
Right.
Habakkuk 2:20 is a good verse that speaks to this. It talks about being silent before the Lord. We're familiar with other verses that talk about being still before the Lord. Mm-hmm. There are psalms that talk about how the psalmist is silent as he waits upon the Lord. Silence is an act of worship. I think this is taking us back to that throne room scene
Yeah.
of chapter 4 and 5, and it is telling us that as a part of this worship, there is silence before the throne. Now, what I think is interesting is, according to Jewish histories, a part of the temple worship in particular, there was this period of silence that was attached with the offering of the incense,
Yeah.
which is what we're about to see. And there is this silence that is sort of offered up in awe of God and in awe of his throne,
Right.
as you would go through this process of burning the incense and covering the mercy seat with the smoke that comes from the incense burning as a part of those temple functions. I've got a quote I want to read on that here in a moment, but before I do that, I want to give you a chance to speak here. Do you kind of agree with where I'm taking that silence? Do you have anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I certainly agreeing with that, and I also think it's just going back to that throne room of, it's this awe, this reverence, right? Like here, before, you know what I mean, there was weeping, there was who's going to be able to take, to break these seals, and then the Lamb, the Lion of Judah, comes in, and as everyone is just holding their breath, right? And then we talk about, you know what I mean, holy, 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 you know what I mean, is the Lord God Almighty, who is, who was, and who is to come, And then here, this like silence, I think there's this another taking breath, you know what I mean, before we breathe out of just like, wow, you know what I mean, this exhilarance, this reverence, this awe of like, he is the Lamb, like he is the God of gods, of above all other things, and it's just incredible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Isaiah 52, one of the servant songs, it talks about how the kings of the earth and how the spiritual beings will be silent before the Messiah as he is slain for our sins, that there would just be this sense of silence, whether it is in reverence or whether it is in embarrassment and sort of shock as those realize what they've done to the Son of God. And in his commentary on Revelation, Sigve Tonstad, what a name, he says this about this silence. He says, this text depicts silence, the silence of shock and awe in the face of unexpected discovery.
Yeah.
But what is the cause of this silence? To what or to whom are all eyes turned that has such an impact? They were astonished at him, the text answers. He quotes Isaiah 52. When this detail is applied to the mystery and revelation, the cause for the silence will not be the events that are disclosed or events still to be disclosed, whether the terrors of judgment or the prayers of the saints. None of this has been lost on the members of the heavenly council, but the eye-opener to them has been the Lamb in the middle of the throne.
Yeah.
When human and cosmic reality is held up to what he is and what he reveals God to be, they are at a loss for words. And I love that description there of taking us back to that throne room and that realization that the scroll is now opened. And remember, only one is worthy. Worthy, worthy, worthy is the Lamb who was, who is to come. And so it's a reminder of that worthiness as all creation is now silent as the Lamb is prepared to speak his judgment of the scroll.
Absolutely.
Right? I think there's also significance here as we think about the silence. I told you that there are Jewish sources. This is not biblical sources, but these are Talmudic sources. These are different ancient Jewish sources that talk about silence was a part of the worship in the temple when it came to ministering in the temple. And interestingly enough, in particular, we're going to be getting a lot of temple worship imagery here in these first two verses.
Right.
It's the silence that we've just talked about, the trumpets that are going to come up, the censer of incense. All of these are picturing worship, in particular, the Day of Atonement as it is described. Let me tell us a little bit about the Day of Atonement while I look up Leviticus 16, because there's a passage here that I want to read.
Yeah.
But I think we're getting here some, just like we had some Passover imagery, back when we talked about the lamb that was slain,
Right.
we're getting into some Day of Atonement imagery now in Leviticus chapter 16.
Yes.
And you're the expert on Jewish festivals, so give us a little bit of a primer on Day of Atonement.
Yeah. So, Day of Atonement, think of it kind of like the modern day for us is sort of kind of Good Friday. And so this Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, was a time where everybody came to the temple to pretty much have their sins be cleansed, that they themselves would be cleansed. And this is also where the high priest, the one day of the year, is able to go into the Holy of Holies, into the presence of God, right? Because at this time, before Jesus and before any of that comes into the picture, God dwelt within the temple and then eventually, or in the tabernacle, and then eventually into the temple. And then there was places called the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And that high priest would only be able to enter into the Holy of Holies only one day of the year. And what day of that year was it? The Day of Atonement. And there was lots of preparation. Lots of things have happened. Before a Day of Atonement, we actually see Rosh Hashanah, which is the beginning of the Jewish New Year, this time of joyous occasion. And here as we go through the festival of this Day of Atonement, now we are realizing, hey, you know what I mean? All the things that I've done, like throughout the year, throughout the past, I'm going to give it to the Lord, and not only to the Lord, to the high priest, to take it into the Holy of Holies, to put it on the altar of incense through the prayers that would be given, so that I can continue to live the life that God has for me, but also live a life that is pure. Even though that we know that doesn't be able to cleanse or do anything, that Day of Atonement is a time to be of repentance, to give that up, to say, here I am, Lord, you know what I mean? I have messed up. I have done those things. Please cleanse me. And so, like I said, I think the best description would be like a Good Friday, you know what I mean? Of just a time of all this time of looking and reflecting at ourselves, of our human fragility, as well as our frailness, that ultimately we cannot stand in the presence of the Lord except through the blood of Jesus. But that's where that Day of Atonement comes in. Yeah.
Oftentimes with the Day of Atonement, we think a lot about the animal sacrifices that are a part of this. There's a bull to be sacrificed for the sake of the high priest and the rest of the priests who are serving in this time. There's also the two goats.
You have the scapegoat, and then you have the goat that's actually sacrificed.
Yeah. And so that's oftentimes the imageries that we think of. But there are other images associated with Day of Atonement that are just as important, but sometimes we don't emphasize as much. One of those is the Day of Atonement is one of the places where we get specifically the description of the white robes that the priest is to wear on that day.
Yeah.
And if you've been following us in Revelation, you know how important this image of the white robes has been multiple times applied to the faithful of God. Both humans and angels have had this description of the white robes. It's this priestly image of God's faithful family. But what I wanted to really emphasize here is verse 12. Then he, the high priest, is to take a fire pan full of blazing coals from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of finely ground fragrant incense, and bring them inside the curtain. He is to put the incense on the fire before the Lord, so that the cloud of incense covers the mercy seat that is over the testimony, or else he will die. He is to take some of the bull's blood and sprinkle it with his fingers against the east side of the mercy seat. Then he will sprinkle some of the blood with his fingers before the mercy seat 7 times. Now, and again, in other Jewish sources, we find out that this entire ritual is to be done in complete silence.
Yes.
And I wonder if this ritual wouldn't take about half an hour to complete. When it comes to the gathering of the incense, the spreading of the blood, all of this thing, half an hour of complete silence. And there's where we're getting our connection back to Revelation.
And that sprinkling of blood actually only happens also in a Day of Atonement. That's where we see it with 7 times. And fun, interesting fact, this is something I learned when I was doing the temple and like really sharing that with my youth. This incense would be a smell that was only specific for the temple. Like no one could use this specific aroma or perfume. It was so much so that if you did, it was like punishment by death. And so when you smelt that incense, you knew that was part of the temple and nowhere else, which I just think is so fascinating because we're going to see this beautiful image, like you said, from Leviticus chapter 16, and as well as what we're getting here, that all this is coming into play, that it's only for God and God alone from the very beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think if we're trying to think biblically about what's going on here in these first few verses of Revelation 8, what we're getting a picture that the breaking of the seventh seal and the opening of the scroll of God's will for the earth, for his creation, is akin to the great Day of Atonement.
Yeah.
In the same way that the Passover is a picture of what Jesus Christ does on the cross, the Day of Atonement is being used by John as a picture of what is going to be accomplished by the King of Kings whenever he wraps up all of human history. Now, what should that tell us about the themes of what's going on? Well, the Day of Atonement was a day in which all sin in the Israelite community was dealt with.
Yeah.
All uncleanliness was dealt with. Uncleanliness of the priesthood and uncleanliness of the people. And it was really a yearly reset of the temple in particular, so that it could be used as God's dwelling place on the earth. Now, the sacrifices had to be repeated over and over and over because the sacrifices, the animals, and the sacrificers, the priests, were not perfectly holy.
Right.
And so that's why there is this repeated element. But I think what John is telling us is that this is all building up to this end day, final and complete Day of Atonement, where no more sacrifice will be required.
Right.
And to learn more about that, I would encourage you to listen to our study on the book of Hebrews. But here we're really getting this idea that the tribulation, the second coming of Jesus Christ, accomplishes what the Day of Atonement was a picture of. That tells us there's never going to be any other need for another coming of Jesus Christ after this happens.
Right.
Because guess what? In the same way that his first coming is a completion of the Passover, his second coming is going to be a completion of the Day of Atonement and the cleansing of creation so that God can dwell with creation. It's pointing again to this ultimate victory that we're going to have at the second coming of Jesus Christ and the reading of this scroll that is going to take place.
Yep.
Okay. So, anything else you want to add there?
Nope.
Okay.
Were you going to say something?
If we want to continue on, I mean, in verse 4, it talks about the smoke of the incense with the prayers of the saints rose before God from the hand of the angel. Again, this is nothing new. We've run into this language before in Revelation chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 8, also Revelation 6, 10 through 11. The incense is the prayers of God's people. And Revelation 6 specifically says that it is the prayers of those who are martyred, those who have suffered, praying for God to bring to completion all of what he's doing. And so there is this cry that is going up to heaven for God to fix the problem of evil in this world. And God is now going to be answering that prayer through the reading of the scroll and the trumpets that will come forth from the reading of the scroll. Right?
Right.
So, okay. Anything you want to mention before we get into the trumpets?
Yeah, so just to clarify, after about half an hour, John would see 7 angels, right, who stand before God, and 7 trumpets were given to them. Now, ultimately, we don't know what these 7 angels are and who are there defined, but a lot of people go back to the fact that these 7 angels go back to Jewish literature that we see from First Enoch and from Tobit of Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, like all these different angels, and that maybe those are the 7 archangels who are about to happen and blow those trumpets. So super fascinating. Again, we're not sure. No one knows. It doesn't ever actually clarify, but that's where a lot of people get their resource is from a lot of that Talmud, the Tobit, that intertestamental period from the Old Testament to the New Testament about the 7 angels.
And while I think that the Bible is perhaps unclear on the identity of these 7 angels, it is not unclear on their role and the part that they play.
Correct.
And Angels in Old Testament literature are frequently portrayed as the agents and mediators of God's judgment. One example of this is the judgment of Sodom and the cities of the plain in Genesis chapter 18. In this scene, it is God who is judging the city of Sodom, but he sends two angels to observe and report back to him about the wickedness of Sodom, to see if what has been said about Sodom is indeed true. And sometimes people ask the questions, they avoid passages like this, and they say, well, why does God need angels to observe and report and confirm what he already knows? Why does God need angels to accomplish his will? You might as well ask, why does God need the church to pray and to sing praises and to evangelize people? Well, God doesn't need the church, and he doesn't need angels. But in his providence, this is how he has chosen for his will to be executed.
Right.
And this is what we see time and time again throughout the Old Testament narratives, is that when God is executing his judgment, he does so through the mediation of angels. Psalm 78, verse 49, talks about the plagues of Egypt. And it says that the plagues of Egypt are executed by the hosts of heaven.
Right.
So even though as we're reading through the description of the plagues in the book of Exodus, more on the plagues in a bit, even though we're reading through those plagues that come upon Egypt, and it says it's from God, and that is true, we also know that God is setting angels as sort of his lieutenants in his army in this battle against Pharaoh and against the gods of Egypt. And so angels are part of God's judgment. They do this in Sodom and Gomorrah. They do this here in the book during the plagues of Egypt. They do this in other places. And here in Revelation, John is doing the same thing. He's now using these 7 angels.
Right.
And again, don't get caught up, I think, with the number 7 per se.
Right.
God is, or Jesus is the God of angel armies. He has a host of angel armies at his disposal. The 7, I think, I would step away from trying to identify exactly who these 7 are, because I don't know that 7 here is meant to be taken literally, that we're meant to know exactly who these 7 are.
Right.
You could think of these as the company, the hosts of angel armies that are accomplishing God's will of bringing judgment across the earth.
Right.
Right. And I think that's what you're getting here. Again, and notice the important role that angels are playing in the book of Revelation. We're seeing that again and again. Okay, so with that, are we ready to move on to the trumpets?
Sure, I think so.
Okay, perfect. Well, we can kind of jump into this next section then. As in chapter 8, we're going to get the first 4 trumpets. Interestingly enough, the seals are also divided into a 4 and a 3, right? There's 7 seals, 7 trumpets. We have the 4 horsemen, then we get the 3 seals after that don't follow the same formula. With the trumpets, you're going to get the 4 trumpets, then you're going to get that divided, and you're going to have another set of 3 trumpets that come after that, with another break. Just like 7 broke up the seals, you're going to get another break in the trumpets that's going to take place in the book of Revelation. So there's a lot of poetry in the way that John is writing this. So where do you want to go from here?
Yeah, wait, do we want to talk about the angel who took the censer and put it on the earth? We skipped that.
We can, yeah.
Okay.
Again, I'm tying
You're
all
kinda
that
tying
into
all
that Day of
together.
Atonement, the work of the high priest,
exactly.
all that stuff. But certainly, if you have more thoughts on that, please do
Okay.
share.
Well, I was just saying, before we get that, you know what I mean, with all that Day of Atonement and with all the prayers and stuff, we see that angel takes that censer, like filled with fire from the altar, and that's the brazen altar. That's where the sacrifice would happen outside of the temple, and would throw it on the earth, and there was peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and earthquake. And we kind of see this number 4, which 4 means nature, you know what I mean, as part of this direction. And I think this is where John is even symbolizing this is happening all over the earth, from north to south to east to west. It is all this judgment is coming upon all of the earth. So, and then that's where, with the 7 trumpets. So now the seven angels who had the seven trumpets prepared to blow them. So we have the first one. The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A natural question that I think we have to ask at this point, and I've paused our study several times to talk about the chronology of Revelation, and remember, there's different ways, that different systems of ways that people make sense of the chronology of the book of Revelation. Some people are futurists, and they want to take the book of Revelation, they want to believe that the book of Revelation is describing often what they think are literal events that will occur in the future, generally tied to a 7-year period of tribulation. There are others that are historicists, and in their view, Revelation is really laying out everything that has happened in God's plan from the time of the resurrection until the time of the second coming. And there, the trick is not necessarily interpreting the literal events that are going to happen in the future, but it's sort of trying to track where we are today in the unfolding of this mystery. And then there are preterists and idealists, people who believe either everything in the book of Revelation has already been fulfilled by the destruction of the temple at the hands of the Romans, or people who believe that the book of Revelation isn't really about fulfilling prophecy at all, but instead it's about these recurring themes of persecution and victory in the face of persecution. And so there really is no literal interpretation whatsoever. The entire book is symbolic or spiritual. All these different chronologies, it's easy to get them mixed up in our head. And some people view Revelation as purely linear. And so you start with chapter 4, and everything that's going forward as it's A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way to until we get to the second coming of Jesus Christ in the millennium. Others view the book as a little bit more circular, nonlinear. This is often called recapitulation. This is a view that this is a word that I've used before, but this is the idea that there is this circular element. How do we see this? And as we get to the trumpets, are we seeing a circling back, or are we seeing a linear progression forward? Believe it or not, there's arguments for both. Okay, so on the one hand, are we seeing a circling back? Well, there's a lot of similarities that we're going to see with these trumpets and with the seals, almost as if they're describing the same events over and again, just from a different perspective. Here you can imagine if you're taking a course on, say, World War II, right? You're sitting down and you're taking this course on World War II. The first lecture that you hear might be an overview that talks about all of World War II, everything that happened both leading up to the war, but also the things that happened afterwards. Then you might go back and you might hear the perspective of World War II from, say, the Germans as they're moving forward in the years prior to World War II. Then in your next lecture, you may circle back and study the same material, but now you're studying it from the perspective of the Allies, in particular England and France, as they're trying to deal with appeasement, the rise of Hitler in Germany, what they're trying to do in the early and mid-30s in order to contain what's going on. You notice how you're telling the same story, and you are progressing in a sense, but you're circling back and you're telling it from different perspectives. So some people think that's what's going on here, and that what we're getting with the trumpets is actually the exact same thing that you got with the seals, and you're getting these redescriptions from different perspectives of the same event. Furthermore, if you notice the end of the seal judgments, in particular the sixth seal, dealt with cosmic unraveling and a universal acknowledgement of Jesus as king. Go back and read Revelation chapter 6, verse 12. When he opened the sixth seal, I looked, and behold, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth, and the moon became like blood, and the stars of the sky fell to the earth as the fig tree sheds its winter fruit when shaken by a gale. The sky vanished like a scroll that is being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Notice the cataclysmic language there. That is talking about the unmaking of reality. That is talking about the reversal of the 7 days of creation. That doesn't sound like something that's beginning the tribulation. It sounds like something that's occurring at the end of the tribulation as God is remaking the heavens and the earth. Not only that, verse 15, the kings of the earth and the great ones and the generals and the rich and the powerful and everyone, slave and free, hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks and the mountains, calling out and saying, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who is seated on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can stand? Again, this is something that sounds like it's at the great white throne judgment, the end of the tribulation, not something that's occurring before the tribulation. And so there's this idea that the seals are not just dealing with things that come before the trumpets, but in fact there's overlap between the trumpets and the seals. On the other hand, though, we have these trumpets tied to the seals sequentially. Notice that the seventh seal is opened, and from the seventh seal come these 7 trumpets. And also notice that there's going to be an escalation of judgment. When the 4 horsemen were performing their judgment was over a fourth of the earth. Now with the trumpets, there's going to be a judgment over a third of different sections of the earth. A third is bigger than a fourth. And so there appears to be an escalation that's going forth, which seems to point that they're not talking about the same thing. So what do you do with all this? Again, sometimes I just pour information out there and I'm like, okay, you go find what you're going to do with all this data now. For me personally, I do think that there is some overlap between what the trumpets are describing and the seals are describing. Again, I can't get away from the fact that the 6th seal is talking about the unmaking of the universe. That the 6th seal is not talking about a period of time before the Antichrist has been revealed. That doesn't make any sense, especially with what we're going to read in regards to the Antichrist coming up in chapter 13, 14, 15. Okay? These descriptions that we're going to get to sections here that talk about the fall of the great evil empire of Babylon. That's not something that occurs before the revelation of the Antichrist. That's something that's going to happen after the revelation of the Antichrist when Jesus comes back. And so think back to that illustration I gave of taking a course on World War II or some other historical event. You get this overlapping effect where you're telling the story from different perspectives at different times. I think that's what we're getting in Revelation. Another illustration, I've used a lot of movie illustrations here. For those of you who love movies, who are cinephiles, right? Some directors, some storytellers in movies do not tell stories in a linear fashion.
Right.
Here I'm thinking about Christopher Nolan. Okay, if you've ever watched a Christopher Nolan film, whether it's a good Christopher Nolan film or a bad Christopher Nolan film, the guy can't tell a story in linear order. Okay, even simple stories like Batman, he tells it out of order. That's just the way he films his movies. That's the way he tells stories. I think we're getting that with Revelation. We're not getting a linear A, B, C, D, but we're getting an A, B, C, A1, B1, C1, C, D, E, B, A, C. There's this circling effect that's going on with Revelation, and it's up to us as we read the text to notice when there is either a circling back to the beginning or there is a telescoping to the end that's taking place. And I think both occur in Revelation. So don't read it as a pure linear sequence, but instead look for these loops, look for these circle backs and these telescoping forward that is telling this overall story. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing there.
No.
But yeah, that's I like to pause and talk about the chronology because people get so tripped up on that. And again, there's both and when it comes to the chronology. There is a level of sequence to it, but there's also this recapitulation, this circling back that's taking place as we go through these trumpets. Be aware of both.
Yeah.
Hold them both in your mind. Don't reject one and accept the other. Say, yeah, there's both going on here, and be okay with that tension. I think that's part of the purpose of Revelation. So, yeah, now that I've kind of done my rant, my soapbox here in chronology, we can get into details with these trumpets.
Right.
So, what do you notice?
Yeah, so the first angel blew his trumpet, and there was hail and fire mixed with blood, and they were thrown upon the earth, and a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Well, I think, you know what I mean? We're talking about, or we mentioned about the plagues. I really think we're kind of going back to this, one of the plagues of Egypt back in Exodus, where one of them was hail, you know what I mean, and fire together upon, you know what I mean, Pharaoh and the Egyptians upon the earth.
Yeah.
That was happening here.
This is our 7th plague of the 10 plagues of Egypt.
Yep.
And this is Exodus 9:23 through 25. Is it significant that we start with 7? You know, because John's not going to go in order here. He's going to jump around with the plagues.
He's certainly going to jump around. And he's going to jump around with days of creation a little bit here, too.
You're right.
So
I don't know. I think that's interesting. 7 is playing such an important role. The first plague he mentions is the seventh plague, right? Mm-hmm. Notice how with the 7th plague, it's both broader but also more limited than what's described in Exodus. And this is actually going to be true of all these trumpets.
Yeah.
So in a way, it's broader, and it's broader in the sense that where the plagues of Exodus deal only with Egypt and Egypt's gods,
Yep.
here the plagues are going to deal with the entire earth.
Right.
So all peoples, all nations. I do think there's a little bit, we're going to get to this whenever we start talking about Babylon. We're going to start getting these references to Babylon starting in this chapter. But there is a little bit of an element of perhaps I'm trying to think of the best way to, for lack of a better term, we're going to start getting imagery of a one world government. Mm-hmm. We're going to get this imagery of a great evil empire that is both a nation, but also can properly describe the world. And so these judgments are being poured out on a single nation, but this single nation is so powerful and is so broad that it represents the entire world. I think this is the nation of the Antichrist. And I don't know how much today we're going to be able to get into detail, but I do think we're going to start getting that futuristic language happening in this trumpets that's going to point us towards a future reality in which a great evil ruler is the head of a worldwide government, a worldwide new Babylon that we're gonna be seeing. So it's broader than the plagues in that it covers the entire earth, but it's also more narrow because in the plagues in Egypt it affects all Egyptians.
Yeah.
Okay. Sometimes the Egyptian people are exempt, sometimes the Jewish people are exempt and their land is exempt.
Right.
But all of the Egyptians are under. So when God sends the plague of hail, all of Egypt is affected by the plague of hail. Mm-hmm. And yet here we're seeing that there is this limitation of a third. Okay. Mm-hmm. So interestingly enough, you're seeing both an escalation of the judgments of Egypt, but you're also seeing a limitation. You're seeing more grace and forgiveness than what's represented in Exodus because It's not all, but it's a third.
Except for we see that the grass was all burned up,
yeah.
though, which I think is significant. You know what I mean? We have a third of the trees and the third, you know what I mean, of the earth, but then all green grass is burned up. So, which I think is really fascinating as well here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I think maybe we need to wrap up.
Already?
Yes, already. Because I know what I've got in my notes for this next section, in particular with the Great Mountain and Wormwood.
Yes.
And it's going to take some time.
Okay.
To work through that.
Okay.
And so we've already been going for over an hour.
Okay.
So I think maybe let's draw some conclusions.
Okay.
And we'll stop with this first trumpet, and we'll do the second, third, and fourth trumpet in our next episode. Does that sound good to you?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So let's draw some conclusions then. Let's talk a little bit about what we're seeing so far. What are some of the broader things that we're seeing as we get into these trumpets now?
Yeah, we're going to see where God is still giving grace upon humanity. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? that even all these catastrophic things that are happening in judgments, there is still grace for people to make the choice to either follow him or to not follow him. And I think that just shows, even as we're going to see for the seven trumpets, a third of which, one third means judgment as a numerical symbolism. However, as we see through all those things, a third of this, a third of that, of this and that, it's not completely all of humanity yet. There's still grace for those to make the choice to either I'm going to follow Jesus or I'm not going to follow Jesus, which just shows how good our God is, right? You know what I mean? That, yeah, he is a God of justice, and we're seeing that, right, with the Day of Atonement, but he's yet still showing grace to his creation of what he's created, as well as humanity, for them to make the choice to follow, which I think is really important here.
I do think that while it's perhaps somewhat, I think with the seals, there is some ambiguity as to whether those seals are things that have occurred, are going to occur, have yet to occur. Although I think both you and I did take the four horsemen as being these future angelic judgments that are
Right.
going to be a part of the tribulation. But I think there's more ambiguity. I think here we really are getting into things that is very firmly futuristic in view. Okay. What do I mean by that? Well, a lot of the book of Revelation, we've been emphasizing, look, this is a book for every generation of believers at every time. And there are lessons and takeaways that we can get. But I do think that John is pointing to something here. He is pointing in the same way that the seventh seal is sort of this great and final day of atonement. He's pointing towards this final culmination of human history. And I do think we're getting more and more futuristic language that is pointing us towards something cataclysmic that is going to occur during this limited time of tribulation. We talked about the tribulation last week. We talked about how there's really no biblical reason to confine the tribulation to a 7-year period or a 3.5-year period. But there is reason to say that the tribulation is a limited period, right? Again, the Bible's not going to tell us how long the tribulation is, but it is going to limit it. And that's what we're looking at. We're looking at this limited time of intense and increasingly intense judgment that is being poured out on the earth, with mercy mixed in. But it is this period of time which, for a period of time, it's going to be very, very bad, but it's going to open up the glories of eternity to those who are followers of Jesus Christ. And these trumpets are going to be pointing towards this sort of futuristic element here. Again, we're going to start getting into with these next trumpets. I really think if you're looking at chronology, John is telescoping towards the end of the tribulation with some of this stuff. And just to telegraph where I'm going to go, spoiler alert for our next episode. I think the mountain that is thrown into the sea in Wormwood, these are not comets. I don't think they're meteors that are hitting the earth, but they are visual representations, visual symbols of evil, angelic, and human kingdoms that are being destroyed by the opening of the scroll. Okay, so we're seeing an end to wicked kingdoms. We're seeing an end to rebellious angels. That's what these trumpets are describing. All of that is things that, again, we haven't been introduced to the beast or the mark of the beast or the false prophet. Like, we haven't seen any of that. And so the only possible way to make sense of that is that John is, in fact, with these trumpets, telescoping forward to what's going to occur at the end of the tribulation. He's not describing things that are setting up the coming of the Antichrist, which, again, a lot of premillennials, a lot of, in particular, dispensationalists, historicists, they would disagree 100% with what I'm saying. And I'm not saying you have to agree with the chronology that I'm presenting there. But I do think that John is pointing towards this final judgment period and what he's describing here.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, we're going to stop there and we'll pick it up. We'll finish chapter 8.
Maybe.
at some point.
At some point.
I don't know when it's going to happen.
I'm not going to say it's going to be the next episode because I didn't know. We don't know.
We're not sure, but our plan the next time we get together is we're going to be finishing off chapter 8. Be reading it. Be reading it for these connections back. And I think it'd be a good idea as you're reading through this stuff, go back and read Exodus 7 through 11.
Right.
Because you're going to get the background that John is using of the 10 plagues against Egypt.
Right. And then I also have, if you would like to learn more about the Day of Atonement or Yom Kippur, I also have an episode that we have. So go back to that if you want a little more information.
Psalm 78 might be a good place to read as well. Psalm 78 is the song that describes what happens during the plagues of Egypt. And John is not only using Exodus, but he's also using that psalm as he's describing these things.
Yeah.
So in particular, this angelic warfare that's going to be playing out. Hinted at in this chapter, really goes into it in chapter 9. So, okay.
Thank you so much, and we will see you next time.
Angelic.